Hello. Good morning, friends. It's so nice to see you. It's a new year and it's time for us to think about our winter session. Can you believe it? I can't believe it. So we're already halfway through January. It's time for us to get out our math handy dandy epic handbook. So find that. I know it's right there ready for you to see. And then also you'll want to pull out your math kit. So here's a spoiler alert. If you haven't opened yet, you may not want to watch because I'm going to open. So let's see what's inside. Lots of fun stuff. Okay, here we go. We have a nice bag. You see a little hint on the bag. It says it's 3D geometric shapes. So here we go. Open up the bag. You'll see lots of cool tools that we're going to be using. Let's see what else. We have a nice sphere here. So we're going to be using these shapes in just a few minutes in our activity. Also, with the solid figures that you have Pete the Cat. And we know all of us love Pete the Cat. From young to old, we all love Pete the Cat. And we're so excited because at GREC, we're going to be bringing Eric Litwin to Bowling Green on June the 8th. And he's going to be at our Literacy Academy. So if you want to know more about that, you're not with our Literacy Academy, let me know and we'll talk to you about that. But Pete the Cat, nevertheless, he always has a lot of fun stuff going on. We're going to use his activities today as we move into learning more about math. And we're going to look at geometry and also algebraic patterns.
Yes, today's going to be, the focus will be geometry and patterns and algebraic thinking. And we'll be looking at Erikson to help us think about developmental progression. I think you're going to enjoy seeing the language in Erikson. It's really nice to think about our kids through that lens. We're going to, again, as always, think about oral language, and we know that those conversations and the interactions that we have with our children and the children have with each other really work to build oral language. And of course, this is always in a shared experience because we know that play is how and the place that we learn. We remember that math is just something that doesn't happen at school. In fact, kids are experiencing math from the very moment they're born. They think about patterns, they recognize routines and patterns. And we know that many of their toys, for instance, that they have are, even though it's not drawn to their attention explicitly when they're very young, but they recognize and see those patterns. Now you're looking at some common toys that we have for our infants, and toddlers too love these toys. It's so much fun to let your kids just explore and then later build on those experiences. Now we're going to look at our scope and sequence for the year and remind ourselves that yes, we're in the right session, that we are looking at geometry and algebraic patterns, and your this and that task that we're going to talk about in a little bit gives you a couple of ways to do that. Our focus today comes from our early childhood standards benchmarks 1.2 and 1.3, and also from our What Works Clearinghouse evidence-based research recommendation 2. I know you remember that that's a big piece of what we've been doing is we've been looking at the research and thinking about what's important for us to teach mathematics. Now it's time to look at our this or that task. Our first task is going to be just all about shapes, and it really connects to page 23 in your math handbook. So after you read the story, and of course you can use the peer and crowd questions if you choose, but after you read the story, we'd like for you to continue the refrain, but this time, instead of talking about the color of shoes, just like Pete does in the book, you would also want to then talk about the shapes. And so what you could do in small group, you could give each child one of the geosolids and practice naming, of course, that solid. Or if, let's say you're doing the pyramid and it's a triangular pyramid, you could have them talk about just one face, just talk about the triangle shape. But anyway, have them practice that refrain. You might chart that up on a chart tablet and continue the song. And, we know how much they enjoy singing their Pete songs. Now, then what they do is they go out and they do a hunt. They look for this. They do a scavenger hunt and look for shapes that are either like the net, the 2D, or the 3D shape. As your children are hunting, have conversation with them and interact with them and ask them questions about what they're looking for, how they know when they find this shape or the figure, what lets them know it. Be sure they describe the attributes of the shape or figure, and then take a look at the Erickson chart and decide if you think that your little ones are emerging or developing or proficient with the use of shapes. And when you look at this chart, it really can inform you about what to do next. It really helps you think about what you're going to do next in geometry. So I would love it for you, when you share back on your flip, share about your experiences. How did the kids react? Were they able to locate with their scavenger hunt? Were they able to find those shapes or figures? And then also, what level do you think they're on the Erickson chart, and what you plan to do next? That's really what we're interested in, hearing about your thinking based on their thinking. Now let's take a minute and look at the that choice of our this or that task. And this time we're going to look at algebraic patterns and just patterns in general. So when you think about patterns, patterns occur in nature. Think about the patterns that occur in the pine cone. I think about patterns that, occur in our soil. We see patterns when we look down at the soil. We see patterns when we look at the rings. When we cut a tree and we look inside the tree, there's just so many different ways to see patterns. But the way we're going to talk about today is looking at the pattern in our book, the verse in our book. So patterns occur a lot in our language, and that's the kind of pattern we're going to look at first. So the first thing you would do is that you would read your book to your children. This is probably a book that you've read before. It's probably not the first time that they've read this book. And while you're reading Pete the Cat, the first time, of course, I know you just enjoy it. Then you ask, what pattern did you see? Did you see something that happened more than one time? It might be that the children want to talk about that how he's walking down, he's talking about his shoes, and he sings about his different colors of shoes. Might be that they want to talk about when Pete says, "Oh no," and when he steps in something. Or could be when we ask the question, did Pete cry? No, of course, the answer is goodness no. So have the children record the pattern, and they don't record the pattern, but they say the pattern. You record those patterns up on chart tablet. So you just go with the flow from what they tell you. Then you ask the question. You'll notice that number 3 on your task says, can you make a pattern a different way? What if we were to rewrite this story? How could we change the pattern? And so, of course, that's exploring patterns in a different way. It's so good for them, which sometimes the definition of mathematics is seen as the science of patterns, because we know the relationships between the numbers, relationships in measurement, the relationships across all the different components of math through a ratio. That's really what mathematics is. All those things like percentages, it's all about the patterns and the relationships within the mathematics. So when we look at story time and we think about stories, it's a wonderful way to build that schema or that context for the algebraic pattern that they're going to be using later. So another thing that I want you to do too, when you look at 4 says, after they jot down the pattern that they see, look at the Erickson table 5.1. Look at where you think they are in identifying pattern progression. It does mention about story patterns there. They may want to go back to other books that you've read. You have lots of books that involve patterns. think about stories like The Three Little Pigs, and so many of our children's books have a pattern in them about what happens next, and it's predictable. All your predictable books are going to have those patterns. So doing a pattern study through language is so important. So take a look at your Erickson chart, see where the kids are. So when you flip back to us, tell us about what the children were able to recognize from the story, the I Love My White Shoes pattern, how they were able to either extend that pattern or make a whole different pattern. And that can lead to all kinds of writing of new stories, and then also how they might connect it with other books they've read. Then lastly, please give us some ideas about where they are on that Erickson progression chart around patterning. And again, why do we do that? We do that Erickson chart. It helps us see where they are in their thinking, but also helps us look about how to plan instruction for next. And we know how important that is. And that really is what we want you to flip back to us about where they are mathematically in their notion of patterns. One more really important piece of work that you'll see on your flip grid is that we've included crowd and peer there. We'd mentioned it earlier one time, but we included a reference to crowd and peer that you might decide to use as you read your story, just as a helpful tool, not required at all, but we always like to include it just so it's there for you.
We can't wait to see what you do with Pete. And you have those choices of this and that board. And if you have any questions, you know how to reach me you have my cell. You also have my email. Please do that. Reach out if you have any questions or anything you just want to talk about in regarding geometry and algebraic patterns. Can't wait to see what you do, because you always take our ideas and adapt it and do even more tremendous things with it. See you soon. Don't forget that April the 14th is our next face-to-face day at GREC. And although we can't wait to see you online, we can't wait to give you a hug there at GREC on April 14th. Thank you. Bye-bye. Goodbye, friends.